Hello, everyone out there watching our webinar, this Heterodox Academy webinar on the state of open inquiry in Canada, where we will discuss some results and some insights from HXA's first ever Canadian Campus Expression Survey. Joining us today, we're very fortunate to have with us, first of all, my colleague, Dr. Nathan Tenundfeld, who's a senior researcher here at Heterodox Academy, and Professors Scott Davies of the University of Toronto and Professor Alexandra Lysova of Simon Fraser University. So thanks to especially our two friends from up north for joining us today. They're going to leverage their expertise and their insights about the Canadian context and bring to bear some of their own knowledge from their disciplines to help us try to understand what's going on when it comes to open inquiry in Canada. So first, as with all of these webinars, I want to remind everyone that in the questioning and answering of questions, but also in our interactions on the panel here, we want to make sure that we abide by the principles of the HXA way. We want to make sure that we make our case with evidence as best we can, be intellectually charitable to one another, be intellectually humble, be constructive, and then most of all, be yourself. Bring your insights, bring your perspective to the table. And as the proverb says, let iron sharpen iron. So, with that in mind, we also want to encourage everyone on this participating in this webinar to do one of at least one of three things, maybe all three of the following things. So, first, we want to encourage people to consider joining HXA, becoming a member. You'll see the QR code there on the right-hand side of your screen. Consider subscribing to our Free the Inquiry Substack, where we drop nuggets and news items that are pertinent to higher education and HXA's mission on a weekly basis. And then finally, subscribe to our newsletter, our weekly emails. So you have got the QR codes there, and you can also go to our website at heterodoxacademy.org and sign up for all these different things there. And we really want to encourage all of you to do that. So with those preliminary matters out of the way, let's go ahead and dive into the Campus Expression Survey that we just did at Canada and some of the top line findings. So, and I'll just start by highlighting three of the things that we here at HXA found particularly interesting, and then I'll ask our distinguished panelists to also weigh in and get some of their reactions. So the first top line finding is just, the most controversial issues, that is the issues that students felt maybe the most reluctant to discuss, were Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I think it was well over half of our respondents said that they were at least somewhat reluctant to discuss that issue in a classroom context. Issues pertaining to gender identity or transgender rights was the second. And then, of course, politics was, I think, the third issue. So those are the three kind of hot button issues that elicited the most reluctance from our sample. So that's one top line finding. Another top line finding worth highlighting here is this very interesting curvilinear relationship between the extent to which a respondent was very left wing or very right wing, and how comfortable they were discussing controversial topics in the classroom. So the basic pattern here is that the more extreme your political orientation is, the more comfortable you felt discussing controversial topics. Whereas if you were more in the middle, the less comfortable you felt discussing controversial topics. That's a very interesting finding that we also saw in data derived from our 2023 Campus Expression Survey on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in the United States, that generally speaking, people on the political extremes felt much more comfortable talking about Israeli-Palestinian conflict on campuses in the US than people more in the middle. And then one other very surprising finding from my perspective is that there was broad support for limitations on free expression, free speech, and especially across the political spectrum. So whether respondents were on the left-hand side or the right-hand side of the political spectrum, there was a lot of support for rules and policies or for attitudes that were kind of um, more positively oriented towards suppressing speech that they found distasteful. So those are three very interesting findings that we detail in the report, and you'd see in the data if you want to do your own analysis. Which, speaking of, we have made a data file publicly available, and we do really want to strongly encourage researchers to poke around, to do their own analyses, and uncover really interesting patterns in the data that maybe we haven't highlighted in the report. So, I'd like to turn to our distinguished panelists and sort of get their reactions to this first ever Canadian Campus Expression Survey. So, Professor Lysova, why don't you take us first here?
Yes, thank you so much. And first of all, I would like to thank you, the host, Heterodox Academy, for inviting us. And second is for conducting this very important survey. So we have an idea about how our students at the Canadian universities feel about the free speech and controversial debate and so on at the university campuses. So this is really important. The findings of this survey was not very surprising to me, based on my reality at Simon Fraser University in Burnaby, Vancouver, Canada. It wasn't not really surprising to see that those students who have more radical political views on the right or on the left were more comfortable or less reluctant to discuss difficult topics. I think the idea here is that these students would indeed, according to the psychological research, they indeed feel overconfident. They feel that they just protecting their views, their agenda, and maybe they are less prone to change their views, and they less prone to be offended by the disagreements with them. So I think this is quite predictable, the way the way the survey found it. And moderate voices were less likely or more reluctant to express the views on very difficult, controversial topics. And I think the issue here is that, particularly in Canada, moderate voices may have more fear being labeled, ostracized, represented as disagreeable, prone to conflict, which again, contrary to Canadian values of politeness. And I think this is a big issue. I actually have one more idea here about the moderate voices, why they may be more reluctant to even express their views in the classroom. It's maybe they're also maybe less likely to be engaged in political issues in general. I actually happen to ask my students some questions about if they follow the elections in Canada or in the United States, and many students seem not to know what's happening in the world. So I think this is another potential issue, that these people do not really reluctant to express their views. They may not have any specific views or may not be really interested in politics. And in terms of the very interesting findings about supporting, less likely to talk about the for example, Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it's quite clear in Canada, public discourse on this issue can often lead to accusation of anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, colonialism. People stay away from this topic. It's very highly polarized, politically charged topic. So even if students have strong opinions, they may want to refrain from discussing these issues, while the topics like EDI, equity, diversity, inclusion, or climate change are more readily discussed. And again, not surprising, because the equity, diversity, inclusion agenda is a mainstream agenda in most of the universities in Canada now. This is not controversial, and many students do not see it as a politically charged topic. So they feel that they can discuss this and they will not be punished for discussing these issues. Yeah, this is basically some of the ideas that I have.
Thanks for those reactions. Professor Davies, go ahead.
Thanks. Yeah, just to reiterate what Alexandra said about thanking you for the survey. I think this is really important. I'm really looking forward to it being reported more widely and having a lot of people interpret it. Just that last note to pick up on, which topics tend to make people, and especially our students, and especially our younger undergraduate students, more skittish and perhaps hesitant to discuss, is that I would say that these topics are the most activist laden. That is, that the way they're discussed on campus, the framings of those topics and the filtering of the information that goes through students are perhaps the most activist oriented. And notice that those two issues, the Palestine-Israel and the trans issue, not only have strong advocates on campus, but they also have counter protesting, counter advocates, which kind of raises the density of the activism latedness of those issues. So EDI, for instance, and climate change, even though they have very strong and passionate advocates on campus, we don't really see counter activists on campus. You know, they might read about it online and hear them in different forums, but on campus, you'd be hard pressed to see a counter protest against, say, an EDI policy. So it tends to be those issues. Maybe the temperature is lowered a bit because you don't have that high degree of activist intensity, and people feel more comfortable discussing them. I think to pick up on what Alexandra said too, that the former two issues tend to have the most kind of stigmatizing responses, that if people don't buy into somebody's preferred line, they're labeled with often unflattering political labels. And I think that a lot of students, recoil from that. I would say, just to bounce off on this interpretation, you know what I find interesting about this survey is that I think in a way, it gives voice to the normies. That is students who aren't particularly political or just learning. They're just kind of finding a lot of political issues now. They're 20 years old or 21, and they're learning. Also, like a lot of people, they tend to be conflict avoiders. You know, they don't like interpersonal tension and they'll avoid it. I think that most people, or perhaps at least half of all students, are like that. So it's interesting that a survey like this, being anonymous and allowing them just to give voice, sort of shows that we have a lot of students in those categories. And I think that's important because I think a lot of our notions about student rights and about catering to students or about accommodating their interests, I think we use an implicit model of more of the activist student, those who are super engaged in issues, have set positions, are confident, as Alexander noticed, and that we tend to have the image of those students in our mind when we devise policies about safe spaces or whatever. And I think we're forgetting about the forgotten half, the other half, who perhaps are or normies, as I put it, or conflict avoiders, who I think need to be given their own space in a way to discuss issues freer of the stigma that might go into those activist laden issues.
Yes, that's a very interesting point, Professor Davies, and I'd like to follow up on that and ask or make a comment and then ask a question. So the comment is one interesting change from previous versions of the campus expression survey is that we kind of intentionally moved away from asking people about whether they would express their opinions to asking them instead to whether they would be willing to discuss their questions, their ideas, and maybe their opinions. Precisely, I think, for the reasons that both you and Professor Lysova have sort of highlighted. For people, the normies, people in the middle, people who are moderate, who are not very politically engaged or politically interested, they might just not have any opinions, right? Or they might have opinions, but they might also be self-aware enough to realize that maybe their opinions are not really grounded in the best base of evidence or argument, right? And so you might think all the same, though, that if you are in an environment, if you're in an institution whose function is to, among other things, facilitate learning and discussion so that you can maybe come to have opinions that are better grounded in evidence and in argument, that that institution would sort of have programming and have its classrooms experience designed in such a way as to actually facilitate discussion of controversial issues where relevant. Like we don't want, it's not a good thing if students are sitting in a linear algebra class and giving their hot takes about Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But, in a class on international relations or the history of the Middle East, this is like a perfectly reasonable topic to bring up and to discuss. So I'm wondering, is there where do you think there's this? I guess it's sort of strange to me that a student would arrive on campus and grant that they don't have any well-formed opinions on controversial issues. Why aren't they expecting to be a little bit uncomfortable and to be challenged and to be put in context where these controversial issues come up? I'd be curious to hear what both of you have to say about that.
I would say this is a very good question, and this is the key issue on us also to move forward with the results of this report and also to improve the climate on university campuses in Canada. I think the point is we don't do a good job currently to prioritize the idea of conversation, confrontation, scientific discussion as is at the essence of the university. And again, when the students come from high school, I mean, they may not have very strong opinions, and we do not really do a good job to support them and encourage them to develop these opinions. Again, I've seen that in Russia. I'm an immigrant from Russia, and I've seen some of these realities when the situation become very toxic, politically charged, people stay away. They don't want to get engaged, and they say, oh, I'm indifferent. Oh, sorry, I'm not interested in politics. And this is so unfortunate that I see it here. And it's not just because people as students are not interested in the political life of Canada or United States. It's just because they consider this kind of how charged the situation is, how emotional everybody and polarized about everything. They just, oh, no, I'm staying away. And that's wrong. The idea is that we should teach more and make a focus on discussion and debate and the rules of communication. It looks like our students simply don't know how even to debate. They don't think that this is at the heart of their education. This is what is expected of them, and this is what is encouraged. And specifically in Canada, they kind of even stay away from this intentionally because politeness and confrontation is not a Canadian thing. I've seen it myself. Simply asking more direct questions, and I see how people feel uncomfortable. They immediately stay away. They consider it as kind of more aggressive. So I think this is a big mistake. And again, what we see currently on campuses is that so many messages, at least on my campus and other campuses I know, bombard us every day with messages about safety, inclusivity, diversity, which is understood as diversity, demographic diversity, not viewpoint diversity primarily, and not about discussion, seeking truth, finding a better way for discuss things. So this is why I think it's so important to prioritize in our teaching and research and not to be afraid to get into discussion and make it a focus in every class where it's relevant. So I, for example, included in some way syllabi directly the commitment to viewpoint diversity and academic freedom. And it basically saying you will not be graded on your opinions. Everyone should be expected to express opposite points of view and see the other perspective. So it looks like we need to do it more broadly. And good thing in the first step, at least at SFU, was that our president in September made a statement on institutional neutrality, which basically said that the institution will not be taken side in the political conflict and will just be focusing on being a forum for all kind of the discussions. So I think this is such an important step. I actually even spread this information among the students and highlighted that this is where we are. And the same with the student organization. It should be the case as well. So it's a forum. Let's discuss, let's meet, let's actually confront each other, like using Socrates' method. Let's do it. Let's fight, right? In a positive way, because this is where we see the truth coming out, not in politely agreeing to each other, silently suppressing our views.
Well, and I think that's a really interesting tie to some of the data that's in there about both the perceptions and fears of consequences, right? So I think 63% of students fear one of the consequences we have in there, of the formal consequences, right? And so I think that's tied to just professor actions. And so being able to say, hey, look, I'm not going to, dock your grade. I'm not going to hold back letters of recommendation because of what you're saying here. I'm not going to castigate you. I think that's an important step. But we also have the data about the number of students who report some sort of backlash. So about 40% of students say that they have experienced some form of this backlash, whether it's formal through the professors or through their social network. And about 50% say that they've had classmates or they're aware of classmates who have dealt with this. And so, I'd love to hear y'all's perspectives. What can be done, not just from the professor's perspective of, hey, look, I'm not going to, hammer back at you here, but to really foster the climate there that can address these concerns of students for what their classmates may be saying on social media or gossip there after class. I'd love to hear from y'all.
Yeah, well, what I would say is that, for good or for worse, that the language of safetyism, which ACA was sort of founded on trying to counter with Jonathan Haidt, talking about safety culture and that we need to push back against it. I think for the generation of students, especially the undergrads going through, the average age was what, about 24 in the survey, that they're kind of been raised in this culture. It's the water that they swim in. It's sort of how they think. Now, maybe this is naive, and I'm hoping that because the term safety in its analogs has become so pervasive in the student culture, I'm hoping that only some of them mean it in the original way, which was, I don't want to hear, views that I disagree with because I'm going to find them harmful and therefore we must shut down anyone. I'm hoping others are using it in a newer way where they're saying a safe space is one where it's free of reprisal, where I can say what I want and hopefully nobody's going to ding me for it, either the instructor through some sort of a reprisal for grades or my peers through ostracism or whatever. So I'm hoping part of it is just the way that term has gravitated to mean something sometimes almost entirely different. Because I think that, we do want to foster, the latter notion of safety that, hey, we can discuss things without any reprisal. And I think for me, that's what Nathan was referring to. And for those of you who haven't read the survey report yet, please do so. Sizable numbers of students are saying they fear reprisal from their instructors. Maybe they're reading their instructors wrong. Maybe they're getting paranoid. Maybe rumors are going off. But I think our administrators need to know that. I think this is a real student rights issue of some sort, that maybe has not been adequately addressed as yet. Because I think instructors maybe would take some sort of reminder that while they have academic freedom, of course, and if they're more activist oriented, sure, they can promote activism in their classrooms, but they can't step over the line and be intimidating or sort of imply some sort of retribution against students who might think differently. And I wonder if that's like one of the key policy implications of this survey is that it's pointing to a problem that maybe isn't getting aired in administration.
And I would just quickly add, Nathan, to your question. So what could be done? And I would say first, institutional stance is really important. University stance and university values. Something that university regularly sends to the university community is important. And again, if we just imagine for a moment, we do not hear that much about safety all the time, but about bravery, or just about the academic discussion. And that would be the focus. Then people hear more and more that that's a norm of our life. That's one thing, and it's very important. I think these messages from the university are extremely important. They create and encourage the certain type of dialogue and the way how the university develops. That is why I think the statement that our university, our president did in September is so important, and encouraging students to not to be afraid and not to attack other students for expressing their views, because this is a rule of our university right now. And then another thing I think is important is to introduce more awards, basically celebrating controversial research, brave research. At SFU, we have Sterling Prize for support of controversy, but it's actually open for all community. It's mostly who are the faculty members who are celebrated, but it could be separately more for students and encourage students to do research in this area so they can be actually acknowledged and celebrated for what they do. So it sends a great message to the community saying, oh, see, it's not a bad thing. It's actually a very great thing. Another thing, regular kind of club discussions to kind of introduce this more into this life and practice skills, because I think it's great to talk about the debate, but if people do not follow the rules of the discussion, never studied logic, they simply don't know how to debate, right? Everybody just screaming over each other. So that's a mistake. They don't know, they don't have a skill to do it. And finally, student academic freedom policies. It's something that we looked at it recently, and it looks like at our university, students don't have strict protections for their academic freedom. And when we ask students, do you have any rights? They don't know. The student services don't know that. I know at US campuses, some universities are great about actually having very clear rules about what is allowed to do and how to allow to do. So that's in terms of practical measures, I think it will be very helpful. So we educate student community as well that these are our rules, so please follow them. And they will get into this and have it as a routine.
Well, we're kind of talking about policy and programming solutions to some of the problems that this report has unearthed. We have a question here about, a very practical question. How do we get the results of this survey and similar surveys in front of decision makers in the university and college space? What can be done to get this on the desk of presidents, provosts, university senates, faculty senates, in front of legislators, whether at the provincial level or at the federal level, and other kinds of boards or authoritative bodies that have some kind of leverage over what's happening on campus.
Well, I've forwarded at my university to a couple of more personal connections in the upper administration. People I know who are very interested in issues of academic freedom on the one hand, and institutional neutrality and civil discourse on the other. But yeah, I think we need to keep going to get to those board of governors and senates. I think that's something we really want to do. I wonder if we can work indirectly. One portal could be just mass media, the major newspapers. I'm pretty sure that if Alex and Nathan wrote up a nice summary, that papers would pick it up in Canada. I'm almost positive they would. And then that would feed back to administration when they hear people talking about their campuses.
Yeah. So I guess, Professor Lysova, you've been especially, I think, successful at affecting a lot of changes at Simon Fraser University. Maybe you could share a little bit about the secret sauce. Like, how do you make it happen?
Yes, I think it's very important to have a community of people, so to find each other at the university, not to work separately, but to find each other and get as a group, because as a group voice, we are much more powerful. So that was really important. And it was important in terms of also supporting each other, just because, again, it's built, particularly when we started 2 years ago, and the first issues that I've noticed at the university 4 years ago, it was psychologically very difficult to comprehend that what's happening is a suppression of academic freedom and suppression of freedom of expression. You no longer can talk to students openly. You constantly walking on the eggshells, thinking if you can discuss this topic or not, if you can ask these questions or not, if somebody complains. So it looks like it's getting much better now, and I'm glad that it's happening thanks to Heterodox Academy measures, thanks to changes in the political landscape or whatever it's happening. Is changing. So being as a group is important. And second is to try to be active on campus is really important. Something that Scott mentioned is just to go and serve on Senate and Board of Governors, and to go and try to become a director or chair of your department, and to become an associate dean. So it's very important to get into those working groups and be present at all those decision-making processes. Of course, it takes time. Of course, it's not really well recognized, especially at some departments, at some universities, but this is the cost. And I'm so glad to see that there are some changes in terms of the psychologically and simply structurally. I think it's so much easier to discuss things right now, and you feel like at the university again. So yeah, some of these important things are important to follow. And of course, to pay attention to everything what you get from the university, all the messages, all the policies. And whenever the requests for consultation come in, and people usually ignore them, everybody's busy. No, it's very important not to ignore them, to look through the documents, provide the feedback, because as I understand, it's again, that's great news, because our administration pays attention to the feedback. They in fact provides a very detailed response to every feedback, every question we ask, which of course encourages for the community to participate. And this is a big difference from my experience in Russia. So this is great. It's how democracy and openness kind of works here, even though there are sometimes we go in some kind of digress, but then we actually will regress rather, and then we kind of get back again with the democratic process. It's good.
Yeah, so your response to that question, Professor Lysova, strikes a very hopeful note. And so this is maybe a good place to ask one of the questions from our Q&A, which is it's a very big picture question, but is Canada losing academic freedom on its campuses? So your answer seems to indicate that maybe the tides are shifting somewhat. I'd love to hear both of your opinions on that kind of very big, large scale question about, what's the trend line when it comes to academic freedom in Canadian institutions of higher education?
I think that's difficult to say, but I'm also optimistic that the tides may be turning a bit. Right after this call, I'm on a call for University of Toronto Academic Freedom Council, which didn't exist just over a year ago, and now we have one. Also, I think that administrations like SFU's administration, U of T's, Toronto's administration is starting to talk about institutional neutrality, sort of doing a mea culpa that they were issuing statements a few years ago that were not neutral, and that they're starting to backtrack now. And I think because of that, there might be an opening to talk about academic freedom and reinforcing it. Fortunately, U of T has lots of language about academic freedom there. Whether it's enacted upon universally, I don't know, that's another issue. But the potential is there to have a strong rule-based or basis for promoting academic freedom. At other institutions across the country, boy, I would say that's a mix. I'd be interested to hear from other people on this call what they're seeing on their campuses. I would say it's very difficult to gauge that one.
I would briefly say that I do think the question is kind of pessimistic, but I agree. We are still losing on academic freedom in Canada. And I immigrated to Canada in 2010. And I didn't feel that way at all. Maybe because I constantly compared reality to my university in Russia, and I felt, oh my God, I can't just express things. It's so free. I don't feel suppressed in expressing my views. And then it changed, and then slowly changed. So something happened, and now we're still losing. I believe we're still losing because every single step is a result of a fight. It's a difficult fight to fight back our freedoms. It's almost like we're getting them back, and it's still difficult. So we're still losing. I think it's very important to be politically active and to have this conversation with the universities. And still, we do have EDI as a major mainstream agenda for universities, and I think this is an indicator that we're still losing that freedom, because this is such a strong ideological agenda that it put on that people still don't even question. They don't even see how political it is. So I do think that I share those pessimistic views, but when I see some minor changes that we make through our fight, it gives me hope. And if more and more of the colleagues and also the students will start finally speaking up their mind more openly and simply realize that nothing bad happened, then we have a little bit more freedom here. But in general, I see how Canadian context is different from the US context with, in Canada, it's a bit, they focus so much on discouraging confrontation and all this politeness, while in the United States is freedom of expression is a fundamental right, right? And I see this context, the difference between the US and Canadian realities so big, and that unfortunately determines why we still may be losing that freedom.
Yeah, so I want to pick up on this is something that was said earlier too, but has come up again. So there were a couple of the topics where a lot of students felt at least somewhat comfortable discussing them. So EDI was one, climate change is the other. And both of our panelists seem to take that actually as kind of a bad sign, right? That maybe conversation has gotten, like, there's so much consensus, at least among the student body, that the opportunity to have real constructive disagreement on issues that maybe need more disagreement, like EDI and maybe climate change or maybe other issues, has sort of, that the moment has passed, right? Do you think there are any other topics on the list of topics that we surveyed respondents on that maybe have that same feature as well? Like, they really ought to be subject to more controversy, but it seems like the students seem pretty comfortable, and that's maybe because there's this artificial consensus that's been built up.
Well, I wonder if I can answer that in a bit of a oblique manner. That one of my concerns about academic freedom and the creation of perhaps a false consensus is in a lot of fields in the university, including my own. Job ads for professors increasingly, I think, have been using highly political language to describe the job, that the specialty is described in ways that activists, not older school academics, would use and would frame topic areas and issues. And I've seen job ads, and my students have to apply for them, where they say, so such and such, the successful candidate must take this kind of perspective. And then they'll rhyme off kind of activist terminology, like a decolonizing perspective or equity lens or anti-oppressive, things that are simultaneously emotionally charged, highly political, but also vague. They're difficult to define, especially in practice. You see them used all the time. And where I'm going with this is that, cannot that be seen as an encroachment on academic freedom from the outset? I mean, you're barring certain people from not even getting into the university as a professor or staffer from the outset. So never mind kind of clamping down on them once they're there. You're not even allowing them to get a job and apply successfully for certain positions. I see that as kind of the next level of academic freedom. And I would invoke, because I think it's got some traction these days, that our job ads need to abide by institutional neutrality, that the description of topics and approaches in an academic discipline should go back to being more neutrally framed, more content specific, and this more, you might call it activist language used to describe them. I think we can't have that anymore. I don't think that is a conducive to academic freedom, heterodoxy. And I think a lot of our normie students applying, worried about their possible reprisals for their views in their classes, I can't help but think there's some connection to that, you know, so.
And I just looked at the list of the topics. You, Alex, asked about us, what the students, if they feel comfortable discussing this. And I see those topics like immigration, indigenous groups, and race. And it appears that students somewhat, half of them, it looks like, comfortable discussing, half of them not comfortable discussing or reluctant to discuss these issues. My impression is that the students even if they discuss those issues, reluctant to discuss them, they discuss them in a certain direction, like EDI. They just repeat those mainstream messages. They do not question or challenge those views. And I think this is for the next surveys. It will be interesting to see this kind of, it's not just discuss how, challenge, right? So I would like to know exactly discuss in which, because discuss and simply agree. I actually like to ask students questions because I mean, many of these questions are relevant to the issue of crime that MA in criminology discuss. And students either repeat the same thing that the government tells us, they rarely bring up new theories. They rarely mention anything that challenges this mainstream agenda, political agenda that dictates us, okay, this is the theory for this topic, that's theory for this topic. They rarely go around this and outside and beyond of this mainstream explanation. And I see it as a big problem. So which is why, again, when I'm looking at these results, I'm not quite sure if it's a good or not. And we need to do a better job in encouraging people to discuss issues from very different perspectives and intentionally encourage them to just discuss it, again, from opposing perspectives. And in terms of what Scott right now mentioned about the job ads are very important. I actually had a discussion with the administration recently, and I mean, the language of the program is all written from a very specific ideological perspective and reflects a very certain theoretical background, theoretical framework. And my question was, don't you think that this kind of description and even using this language discourages people who disagree with that? And the basically answer no. I mean, we don't explicitly say we discourage people with different opinions, but the language itself reflects it. That's the whole point of self-censorship, when people don't even want to get to that place because they know they will be constantly fighting for being accepted and for being heard. So that is why I think the next level is, how do we actually find that common ground when we introduce these different views into our writing and do the job ads neutral and explicitly open for diverse opinions. So that would be the key, to actually explicitly invite people with diverse perspectives and political views. And political view is it's a protected characteristics in BC. So it's very important, but I don't see we use it very often. We don't really advertise it broadly. So it's somewhere hidden. We mostly talk still about the same categories. So I think we could do better than that.
So, Alexandra, you raised an interesting point there where you were talking about kind of the preparation of students, which I think ties into a question we had from Joanna. I'm going to read the question now. I'm curious if the panelists might see any connection between the lack of ability to engage in skill debate and the experience of students with K through 12 education systems in Canada. Is it possible that a lack of national education standards might play a role? If so, are there changes that changes that might be important to consider? And before I hand it over to you all, just one important thing. I don't think we reported this in the write-up, but when we looked at the differences in reluctance as a function of either undergraduate or graduate status, there weren't really any differences there. So it does not seem as though the educational experience in Canada is necessarily, or at least at the higher ed level, making students more or less prone to self-censor there. So I'd love to hear from you all, kind of what are your perspectives on the standardization of education and those preps.
Well, I guess I don't see a lot of emphasis on small c critical thinking. So not to demote critical theory with a capital C, but small c critical thinking. You know, the art of persuasion, of logical consistency, referring to evidence. You know, I think that's been a casualty of the culture wars of the past decade or so, that it's almost seemed like if you're a thoughtful, open-minded person, that in certain contexts, it's like you're somehow displaying weakness, that or disloyalty to a side or to a tribe. And that's really unfortunate. I think that's really happened. But at the K-12 level, you know, I don't see that as a priority about learning, you know, those critical thinking skills beyond just sort of your standard lip service that people will say, well, of course, it's like a no-brainer. But an actual policy or curriculum that outlines ways to engage in fruitful, you know, persuasion and so on, I don't see it. And in fact, I think the trend, and this is a negative statement, the trend has been more to promote motivated reasoning. to start off with your conclusion and work backwards and justify your conclusion. In practice, I'm afraid that's happening quite a bit. So is that tied to educational standards? I think a lot of provinces in Canada, boy, they would have to rethink their curriculum to engage in that kind of promotion of critical thinking, because I'm not really seeing it at this point.
Yeah, I share Scott's concerns. My both children are in elementary school now, right now in Canada, in British Columbia, and how to say it mildly, I'm not quite happy with what I see. My major concern is that the school is so highly politicized, and it's not explicitly recognized or acknowledged for the children. It's almost like presented as a truth by itself. So I needed to go to school several times and basically saying, how can you teach it as if it's the truth? It's just one of the perspectives that you presenting, but you presented it as this is the only perspective. Why don't you say that they can disagree? Why don't you say that they can ask questions and challenge this perspective? So to me, this is a great question that somebody asked that question about the K-12 education and what we see then in at the universities in Canada. Highly politicized system that doesn't really encourage much of the thinking. I've read in their forums that critical thinking is one of the focal important goals, but I haven't seen it other than just treated in that form. And I've just recently, last week, I received that survey from the school board, basically something about how we can improve the education in Burnaby. And what I've seen is that there is a focus, how can we improve and increase diversity, inclusion? And we see the same EDI issues over and over again. And I haven't seen any question about the critical thinking, about excellence education, about competitiveness, about curiosity in our students, about support of the talented children or those who just bored currently in schools. I do see that we have very big issues. I'm not sure how to standardize or not to standardize education in Canada, but it's so important to definitely revisit it and revise it, and prioritize learning, curiosity, open-mindedness, and critical thinking, rather than just hammering our children with all these messages that they think is just the ultimate truth, which is not, of course.
Maybe I can just pick up on that before maybe you raise the final issue, is that I think part of the phenomenon here is that administrations in education, whether it be higher education or K to 12, they really want to be seen to be responsive to emerging issues, to engage with communities, and to engage with various social movements. Unfortunately, the default mechanism for doing so is often to engage not with really knowledgeable scholars on topics, but with lobbyists and activists. That's who they actually engage. And that's what I think for them is their version of engaging communities, when you just sort of engage with a lobbyist of some sort for some cause. And, older social movement research would suggest that often activists are connected mostly to each other in small networks rather than to some deep community at large. And I think that a lot of our administrations, both K to 12 and in universities, that's their default mechanism. I guess it's easy, right? To hire a consultant, hire or respond to a lobbyist, than to maybe engage with the scholarly community in an area.
Yeah, so I'd like to ask just one quick follow-up there. One of the things y'all had talked about before was graduate students going on the job market and job applications. I'm curious if y'all are seeing any sort of effects of the younger faculty members in your department who maybe have come up in kind of this more self-censorious academic environment, and are there principal differences in how they're approaching scholarship from how y'all may have when you started your career?
I'm sorry. Do you want Scott to that? Yeah. I would say I do see some of them are struggling, but overall, I think we're hiring people who have inclination for certain political views. So we take what is called like-minded people, and that's where I see we have a problem. just because we intentionally, this idea of good colleagues, we take people who think the same, and we all create this echo chamber when everybody feel comfortable, and everyone who challenges that very convenient, very comfortable and safe environment is considered to be aggressive and direct and going against some rules. So that is why in this climate, most of the people who are young faculty are just sharing the same views. They knew what they're getting, but those who not, and I've seen those, they saw the faculty members who left the institution, and some are thinking to leave the institution just because they can't cope with all this stress, and this is not how they envisioned the work at the university.
And I think what I'm seeing is that sort of academic work does allow someone to really just bury themselves in their own thing, to focus on their laptops in their own writings, and to teach classes that are very connected to their specialty, that don't veer off otherwise. And yeah, I think a lot of people are continuing to do that, that's sort of something that the university affords. It's a safe route for sure. And I think it's a one that's often traveled.
Fantastic. So I've got one more question here. Let me search through the questions, see if there are any that have gotten really upvoted that we need to touch on here. So one thing that I would love to get y'all's perspective on, the last figure in our report shows responses from what has been termed the left-wing authoritarianism scale, and it's about kind of the roles of free speech, free expression. And what we find is that there's no real principal difference between ideological left and ideological right on these. And so I'd be interested to hear what y'all think is driving this kind of cultural uniformity amongst kind of, the political extremes towards, free speech isn't as important as employees feeling, psychologically safe and things like that.
I would say that we still see this. I would still see it as the representation of this Canadian reality with the focus on politeness and avoidance of conflict. And so instead of the supporting the discussion, it's more about just shut up and don't say anything, which I disagree with. So this idea kind of block the conflict at the beginning. What it's interesting indeed to see that the left winning and right winning students have very similar tendencies, although we didn't expect that to see. I think just because of, students on the left, particularly on the radical left, may favor restrictions to prevent hate speech, microaggressions, and then it's just been this tool of basically suppressing speech. Don't say disagree with this, and feeling that they have so much power, and also this idea of being on high moral grounds to do that. While people on the right, they may right now kind of mirror those strategies used by the left. I mean, sometimes people feel tired of just sitting quiet and being polite. You just do things like the other side doing it. So that's my only explanation why students on the right may also feel that they want to stop woke indoctrination and simply critique or do something with the theories just are scientific. And why do we even discuss them in academia or present them as valid if they're not? So I see this kind of, maybe some kind of anger coming from both sides. That's my only explanation. I actually don't know. So we need to look into this more.
Yeah, it would be great to do some sort of maybe qualitative follow-up study where you do interviews or focus groups to try to dig into these issues. We all like mixed methods in sociology, so that would be an approach there. Because, my go-to answer would be, well, this cohort, they grew up, these appeals to third parties, as Bradley Campbell would put it, that is sort of a natural thing to do. Whereas previous cohorts would have said, no, if you don't like the way someone speaks, deal with it, whatever. And the newer cohort perhaps has not been raised in that way. But it'd be interesting to say, like for what Alexandra just talked about, if whether people who are more conservative, almost like for revenge purposes, will say, well, if they shut down my speaker, we should shut down theirs. It'd be interesting to see if we could uncover that in interviews or focus groups.
We've got about 5 minutes in our scheduled time, and I'm going to ask what might be a very hard question of both of our panelists. But so you've engaged with this report in a great deal of depth, and you've also been very engaged in HXA-ish reform sort of activities at your institutions. I'm curious, what is one concrete thing that you are going to do as a result of engaging this report, just within your sphere of influence, as limited as it might be? Like, you're not going to be able to change things in Canada at large, but both of you do have power and influence. And so I'd love to hear, just help get some of our participants on this call, get their creative juices flowing, help expand their imaginations for what they can do to improve the state of open inquiry in Canada. So what's maybe one concrete thing that you might do with this report and with the underlying data?
Well, on my end, I wonder a renewed recruitment drive to form student versions of Heterodox or some sort of offshoot of them. My hunch is that there'd be an appetite amongst students for more of this, and that this survey could be a bit of a signpost that there's some appetite for this. The other one too is, and this is not an immediate action item, but I wonder if more sessions on controversial issues could be sponsored that are really just informational in character. That it's for people who are curious about controversial issues, don't know the background, and just want to find out things. And if we could create the safe spaces in using the newer understanding of the term, where it's free from attribution and stigma and so on, I wonder if there'd be appreciation of that amongst a lot of students. Just informational sessions, non-judgmental, they can wear disguises if they don't want to be, spotted. But yeah, that's sort of, one's a short term, recruit students in heterodox-like organizations. Longer term, maybe sponsor these informational sessions.
And I would just add to what Scott mentioned, probably something also beyond university is, and I think, Scott, you mentioned that, is to popularize, to distribute the results of this survey to the media. So I think it's really important that the general public knows about the study. And I know particularly local, at the local level, somewhere there, something that people really need to discuss and read. I think this is really important because it has some pressure on the universities because they're constantly saying we serve in the community. And that's really important to show that what kind of trust the community has to the system. And if there are issues at the university and they're dependent on the students and parents sending the children to the universities. So I think it's really important to create both effects within the university and also outside of the university, to have the discussion with the general public and have pressure on the university from that side as well.
Great. Well, just to wrap things up, first, let me just thank our distinguished panelists, Professor Davies, Professor Lysova, for taking time out of no doubt a very busy day. We're very grateful for all that you do for Heterodox Academy and for joining us today, especially. I want to thank everyone who participated and asked questions and answers. We're very sorry we couldn't answer all your questions. I think we're going to keep a running tally of maybe unanswered questions, and those that we're in a position to answer, we'll follow up on. The last few things I want to say is, in view of trying to get the report out, get the word out as much as we can, please do share via various social media channels, via word of mouth, the news of this report. Share it with your friends, your colleagues, share it with your enemies, right? Share it with your administrators, and just get the word out so that this information really does get in the right hands and does have the beneficial influence that we hope it has. And then, as I said in the beginning, if you're not a member of Heterodox Academy, please do apply for membership. It doesn't cost anything. It's a very simple web form you fill out on our website at heterodoxacademy.org. Subscribe to our Substack, Free the Inquiry, and also sign up to receive our weekly bulletin emails. And with that, again, thank you to everyone for participating. Thank you, Professor Davies and Professor Lysova. We really appreciate it. Have a good rest of your day.